You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
I mean, the idea of a Nicaraguan canal stretches back to the Spanish conquest. 16th century conquistadors are suggesting building a waterway. It's a pretty narrow stretch of land. It's like less than 20 miles between the Pacific Ocean and Lake Nicaragua. It's also more level than Panama, so it's not about getting over giant mountains. To 1820s folks, the narrow land at the center of the world, where the oceans could almost touch, looked like an X marking a natural treasure. But in the early 1820s, it was also an X when it came to information. Very little was written about Central America, especially in English. Writers who had mostly never been to the isthmus relied on secondhand information to advocate for three potential routes, which was a sort of Goldilocks of canal choices.
Hello, and welcome to episode 428 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. In the 1820s, bold men believed that they could slice through a continent and control global trade. They imagined a shortcut between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, not in Panama, but through the wild, rain-soaked terrain of Nicaragua. What inspired these canal dreamers to believe this was possible? What does their story reveal about the ambitions, illusions, and geopolitics of the early American Republic? Jessica Lepler, an associate professor of history at the University of New Hampshire and author of Canal Dreamers, the epic quest to connect the Atlantic and Pacific in the age of revolutions, joins us to explore these questions. Now, during our exploration, Jessica reveals why Nicaragua seemed like an ideal place for an interoceanic canal, how shifting politics, speculative finance, and ecological ignorance doomed the Dreamers project, and what this forgotten chapter of history tells us about American diplomacy and power in the post-revolutionary world. But first, have you ever wished you could step inside a Ben Franklin's World episode and actually talk with our guest historians for yourself? This is exactly the experience you get inside the History Explorers Club. You get to interact with guest historians and ask them your questions. Each month, you'll join live conversations with expert historians, learn something new together with your fellow history explorers, and ask all the questions that you've been carrying around. The History Explorers Club is really a warm, curious community of people who love early American history just as much as you do. And the doors to full membership open on January 19th. So join the waitlist now so you get first access when we launch. Join now at historyexplorers.club. That's historyexplorers.club. All right, are you ready to venture into the 1820s and explore the big dreams of canal dreamers? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Joining us is an associate professor of history at the University of New Hampshire. Her research expertise is in the early Republic United States and the long 19th century. Her first book, The Many Panics of 1837, People, Politics, and the Creation of a Transatlantic Financial Crisis, won the James H. Broussard Best First Book Prize from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. She joins us today to discuss details from her second book, Canal Dreamers, the epic quest to connect the Atlantic and Pacific in the age of revolutions. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Jessica Lepler.
Thanks, Liz. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, we love to talk about canals, so I think we're going to have a really fun time today. Now, long before the construction of the Panama Canal, early Americans believed that there was a possibility of building a canal across Central America. During the 1820s, Americans, Britons, and Central Americans wanted to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans with a canal across Central America. Jessica, would you tell us about the early American desire to build a canal that would link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans during the 1820s?
Yes, I would love to. The Panama Canal opened in 1914, and this was nearly a century after the 1820s canal dreamers that I studied thought the construction of an Isthmian canal was predestined. To them, the question was not if a canal would be constructed, but who would do it. Canal dreamers of the 1820s in the US, England, and Central America thought the canal was predestined because when they looked at a world map or a hemispheric map, the narrow Central American isthmus was located basically at the center. And if you squinted, the land disappeared. They thought building a canal would be that easy because the Erie Canal, which linked what we now call the Midwest and the Atlantic Ocean, was about to open, and it would transform the U.S. economy. Also, a Scottish canal had just connected the Atlantic to the North Sea, so there was a canal boom going on in the 1820s. But going back even further, since Columbus, Europeans and their descendants had been trying to find a shortcut to Asia. In the 1820s, the Age of Revolutions, which Ben Franklin had played such a large role in launching, it'd been raging for a half a century, and it finally reached Central America. To 1820s folks, the narrow land at the center of the world, where the oceans could almost touch, looked like an X marking a natural treasure. But in the early 1820s, it was also an X when it came to information. Very little was written about Central America, especially in English. Writers who had mostly never been to the isthmus relied on secondhand information to advocate for 3 potential routes, which was a sort of Goldilocks of canal choices. The southernmost route was through Panama, which was then part of Simón Bolívar's newly independent Gran Colombia, and the Liberator refused to allow a canal to be built until his new nation was diplomatically recognized in Europe. The northernmost route was through Mexico, which had declared independence from Spain but was politically unstable. The middle route, however, it seemed just right. It ran up a river from the Caribbean to the large freshwater Lake Nicaragua and then across a less than 20-mile strip of land. So, in these canal dreamers' minds, not much digging would be required. There was so much water already there, and the new Republican government seemed willing to shape its canal proposals to the desires of foreign investors. So kind of like a barely buried treasure, the Nicaragua route was the preferred route of the era.
To understand these canal dreamers and their hopes and dreams of building a canal across Central America, we really need to understand the geography of Central America in the 1820s. Jessica, throughout your book, Canal Dreamers, it seemed confusing for early Americans to get a handle on who they were trying to talk to and negotiate a canal route with. So, were early Americans dealing with one country? Were they dealing with multiple countries? How should we think about the geographic language and really the national landscape of Central America at this time?
So Ben Franklin had been dead for about 30 years when the Age of Revolutions reached Central America. And Central America had been a Spanish province that included the present-day nations of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, as well as a little bit of what is now Mexico. And so when Mexico declared independence in 1821, the provincial leaders of this region, who were located in Guatemala City, they followed suit. They also declared independence. But very quickly, Mexico annexed Central America, which some Central Americans supported and others vehemently opposed, to the point where some San Salvadorans actually came to the U.S. to try to get their province annexed to the U.S. as a state. So this Mexican annexation was very controversial. And the Mexican form of government was also in flux. It became an empire for a short period of time. And in that time, Central America was part of the empire. But when the emperor was deposed, Central American provinces, these 5 Central American provinces, broke off and formed their own country. But just like in the US, they didn't immediately form a final version of a government. They formed a provincial government. So for the first few years of the 1820s, first they were part of Spain, then they were part of Mexico. Then they were their own sort of in-between new government. And then they finally had a constitution and a president and a 2-house legislature and all the sort of framings of a Republican government by the mid-1820s. And so this period of time is very much a story of the Age of Revolutions in a place that took a little bit longer to get to than like the US.
How long did it take for Central American countries to decide what their form or national geography would look like? Because it does seem like this region is very much in a state of political flux during the 1820s, making it truly confusing as to who early Americans should negotiate the construction of a canal with.
I'm not sure if they really accomplished a stable central government in the 1820s. Within 2 decades of independence, they pretty much had broken into separate independent nations as we know them today. So just like we had a critical period in the US, the critical period in Central America doesn't end with a federal government in the same way that the US story does. It's the sort of civil wars, both within provinces over the shape that government was going to take and between provinces over the power structures of that regional republic. They never really get fully resolved. And this canal contract negotiation of the 1820s is happening during periods when it seems like they have established new rules, new rulers, new people to negotiate with, new sovereignty over the canal route. But then it pretty quickly changes to a period of flux again. And so it is not a stable time. I don't think it's that much more unstable than other places experiencing the Age of Revolutions. It just happens kind of late. It happens after all the other new republics of the Americas had kind of formed nation states. And so one of the things that I found in this project was that Canal Dreamers happened a bit too late. I mean, it's tempting to think of them happening as too early with the Panama Canal in 1914 and all that. But they were late in an age of revolutions kind of way.
Well, now that we have a sense of the fluid political dynamics of Central America in the 1820s, let's talk about the physical geography of this region. So when we read your book, Canal Dreamers, these dreamers seem really focused on this slight bit of land across the Costa Rican border that takes you up to Lake Nicaragua. And then, as you said, Jessica, there is this tiny slip of land that further connects Costa Rica with Nicaragua. And that would have had to been cut through in order to really connect the Atlantic with the Pacific. But when we look at a map of Central America, and I'm acknowledging here that we have the luxury of hindsight, but still, when we look at a map of Central America, that land strip across Panama just seems so much thinner than this Lake Nicaragua route. So why were early Americans so set on building a canal, but only via this Lake Nicaragua route?
I mean, the idea of a Nicaraguan canal stretches back to the Spanish conquest. 16th century conquistadors are suggesting building a waterway. It's a pretty narrow stretch of land. It's like less than 20 miles between the Pacific Ocean and Lake Nicaragua. It's also more level than Panama. So it's not about getting over giant mountains. They don't know exactly how level it is, and that is a big issue in the canal dreams of the 1820s. They just don't have the data. But they didn't have to go over big mountains. And Nicaragua has this giant freshwater lake in the middle of it. So one of the things you need for a canal is a water supply if you're going to use locks. The locks are like elevators for boats. And if you needed to lift boats up and down, you needed to be able to fill these sort of sections with water. And Lake Nicaragua is this large body of water that was sort of there. There's also a river that stretches from the lake to the Caribbean. And early in the 16th century, it was navigable by seafaring vessels, at least some times of the year. But a combination of an earthquake and a lot of pirates made it a less desirable transit point. So the Spanish Empire didn't use it that much. But Nicaraguans, whose main cities were all on the Pacific side, continued to argue for building a transit route there and for the Spanish Empire to invest in it. By the 1820s, it wasn't just a geographically desirable place because there was a lot of water and a very little bit of flat land that they thought they could just use to make a waterway, but also like the political environment and the financial environment of Central America was more appealing to British and US investors than Panama, because Panama was part of Gran Colombia, and that was a whole different entity to negotiate with. Whereas this newly forming country, being a bit late to the Age of Revolutions, meant that while they were trying to negotiate canal rights, the country was also forming. And so there was a chance to sort of use the political flexibility of that moment to create the ideal circumstances for building a canal. So it's a desirable place in a political way and a desirable place from a water perspective. The water cycle, however, in Nicaragua is crazy. It is very seasonal. There's a huge dry season where the river dries up to almost like pebbles. I mean, it's very much full of sediments. There's sandbars, there's rapids that become almost insurmountable. And then the rainy season is flush with water, which would make it a fairly good place to send your boats along. But the land side of the canal, not the river and the lake, but the place where you'd have to dig, is problematic because it gets so much rain that it's an almost impassable piece of land. So it's all or nothing kind of in the water supply that they were thinking about. But they don't really know that because canal dreamers of the 1820s have almost no information about this place. They just see it on the map as having a river and a lake and a narrow, relatively flat stretch of land.
It's really interesting to think about how these canal dreams of the 1820s were linked with the so-called Age of Discovery, that period when Christopher Columbus and Henry Hudson and all these other explorers were setting out across the Atlantic with hopes and dreams of finding a shorter route to the East Asian trade markets. And it's also interesting to think about how the Age of Revolutions in the early 19th century period created a lot of economic opportunities for those who seemed willing to gamble in the hopes that they could create a fortune for themselves.
Oh my gosh, there's so much gambling. It is just a wild ride, especially in the sliver of time between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the Panic of 1825, which ends the sort of British gambling in Latin America. There is this huge rush to invest in formerly Spanish silver mines, in pearl fisheries, in basically all the wealth that the British have been sort of watching Spain acquire for centuries. They're like, well, this is our chance to capitalize on this. And it is through the private corporation, the incorporated joint stock company, where stocks can be traded on open markets. So you get a speculative boom where lots of people are imagining gambling on Spanish potential, formerly Spanish potential wealth. And in the US, there are similar desires sort of cash in on the end of the Spanish Empire and turn some of the assets of that gigantic place into US profit and really private profit. Lots of people thinking about how to make their own fortunes out of the sort of end of the Spanish Empire. So yeah, pretty cool. Lots of gambling.
And that was something that was very strange to me. When we read Jessica's book, Canal Dreamers, we discover that there were a lot of people in Great Britain, in the United States, and in places like France and the Netherlands who were interested in building a canal across Central America. But it was really, just as Jessica just said, more individuals who had this interest than actual nations having an interest in this. So Jessica, could you talk about why a canal through Central America seemed to have been more of a project of private enterprise versus a project of public sponsorship?
Thank you for that question. There's like so many ways I could answer that question. And so I want to start first with the fact that governments were involved in private enterprise in this era. So that's a sort of interesting twist we have to think about. In order to create a company that could be sued separately from the people who led it and that could trade shares on secondary markets like stock markets or bond markets, people sought acts of incorporation from legislatures, and this happened on both sides of the Atlantic. So Parliament created corporations, including Isthmian canal companies. And in the US, the federal Congress very rarely incorporated a company, but it did create the first and second banks of the United States by federal charter. Most charters came from states. Aaron H. Palmer, the man who actually won the contract to build a canal in Central America in the 1820s, initially sought incorporation by the federal government. But President John Quincy Adams didn't devote his already waning political capital to this plan. In fact, Adams wanted a canal. He was a canal dreamer too. And he wanted the US to build a canal, but not as a nationalist enterprise, as an internationalist enterprise. He wanted a coalition, a canal built by coalition with the hemisphere's other nations. But he faced so much resistance in Washington that this was a non-starter. And he and Secretary of State Henry Clay actually changed the instructions that they provided to diplomats headed to the Panama Congress in 1826. And they said initially, try to negotiate with the other countries and let's produce a canal as a hemisphere. But in the end result, the edited version, they instruct the diplomats not to commit the U.S. to constructing a canal and to even get the other countries to fund the investigative, scientific, and engineering research for a canal. So they pull back from it. And while Palmer was unsuccessful in acquiring a federal act of incorporation, he sought a charter from New York State, and he recruited the sitting governor, DeWitt Clinton, who was a canal man himself, to his cause. So beyond the acts that created corporations, which were government initiatives, some canal dreams involved building a canal by treaty. In fact, the first diplomat sent from Central America to Washington, a man named Antonio José Cañas, he was instructed to negotiate a treaty that would result in Central America and the U.S. jointly building a canal as a public work. But while Cañas was in Washington, the Central American government changed. As I said, it was pretty flexible. It was changing a lot. And his bosses changed, his instructions changed, and the new administration in Central America and the first president in Central America wanted a canal via private contract rather than government treaty because he recognized a need for money to come into the country as quickly as possible. So the answer to your question is that public and private entities were interested in constructing a canal, but it ended up being a quest for a private contract.
And what was the allure of a private contract? You mentioned Aaron Palmer and DeWitt Clinton. There was also an American man named Curtis Bolton. What did these men see in trying to be the one who secured this contract and make this Central American canal happen?
There was a wave of excitement in the U.S. about an Interoceanic canal that we can see in newspapers. And the men who sought State Department appointments to Central America were typically Canal Dreamers as well. But in the end, there were two New Yorkers who became the lead rivals for the canal contract. Aaron H. Palmer, who you mentioned, Curtis Bolton, and we'll talk about DeWitt Clinton too. But all of these individuals sought a canal for their own purposes. Kind of like a canal itself, you use it to get from one thing to another. These folks were all using a canal to accomplish something in their own lives. And so the first of these individuals, Curtis Bolton, I want to tackle him first. He was from a Southern mercantile family, and he relocated from the South to New York with his brother and their wives, who happened to be sisters, and also all of them were cousins, which is kind of interesting. And the Bolton brothers were initially partners in a mercantile business, but the older brother became the president of the first canal to bring domestic coal to New York City. And perhaps out of sibling rivalry, Curtis Bolton wanted to be the president of a bigger, more important canal. So he did a lot of the legwork to get the canal contract. He and some business associates actually sent the only surveyor to reach the canal route in the period as a private enterprise. And when the mission went astray, Curtis Bolton himself actually traveled to Nicaragua and tried to negotiate directly with the interim Central American government for a contract. When he came back to the U.S., he connected with Cañas, that Central American diplomat. He used his network in the Adams cabinet to try to influence the first U.S. diplomat who successfully made it to Guatemala City. And he tried to get that guy to support a canal contract going to a U.S. company. He thought his competition were British companies, but of course the Panic of 1825 had happened, and that wiped out most of the British competition. He didn't know that there was a competing U.S. interest in the canal. And so it turns out a fellow New Yorker had also sent an agent to Guatemala City, and all of Bolton's work ultimately led to this other man, whose name is Aaron H. Palmer, winning the contract. So it's a complicated, fascinating story about the competition between these two folks. Bolton was so angry when he found out that Palmer won this contract, that he'd done so much work to try to secure for himself, that he set out to cancel Palmer's contract. Now, Palmer was his own fascinating character. He was an excommunicated Quaker, a Freemason, a lawyer, and a polyglot who spoke about a dozen languages. But he was also a bit of an ass. And when I say that, I mean he was literally depicted with donkey ears in a precedent-setting legal case, right? In a portrait that became the center of a precedent-setting legal case. But he was also a visionary who imagined a world in closer communication. And what Palmer wanted out of this was not to beat out his older brother, but to get a government job or a secure job that would connect the world. He had wanted to be a diplomat for ages. He never got one of those positions. And so this would be his chance to bring the world into closer communication, which was his mother's sort of dream of the world. And so I think for him, it's more aspirational. Now, DeWitt Clinton was governor of New York at this point. He had been the force behind the Erie Canal, which made his state very wealthy, but didn't lead to personal wealth. He had a very large family, and he had lots of non-paying offices. He had lots of patronage to give out, but he didn't have a lot of money. And I think he saw in hopefully becoming the president of a private interoceanic canal company the chance to make a second canal pay out for him in the ways the Erie Canal had paid out for New York. So all three of these characters have their own reasons, and none of them have that much to do with a canal.
So we have these canal dreamers who were interested in building this canal, as you said, hopefully to go from one aspect of their life to a different aspect of their life. And almost all of their dreams involved becoming rich. But we also know that building a canal requires extensive surveying and a whole lot of money. You need money to pay surveyors, for construction workers, and for the equipment you need to actually build the canal. And you're going to need a lot of time to build a canal. So what information or data did these dreamers have to work with as they're thinking through the economics of their canal project, when they're devising their plans and budgets? What information did they have to rely on?
The answer here is shocking. They had almost nothing. They had almost nothing to work with. There had been some English language accounts of the canal route from the beginnings of the Age of Revolutions. I mean, the British actually invade Nicaragua during the American Revolution and make it as far as the headwaters of the river, but they don't actually get across the lake. And so there is a little bit of prose about the river from the soldiers who survived, which was not all of them, from this failed invasion. And there is some chatter in the scientific community about canals, but pretty much all of that is not based on reality. Like none of the sort of folks who are advocating for a Nicaraguan canal in the beginning of the 1820s had actually gone there to research it. There is a map that is circulating through both governments and private hands in this period that was created by the first mayor, basically, of the city closest to the canal route in Nicaragua. But it's called the Plano Ideal, which is like the ideal map. And it is totally an idealized version of a canal map. It doesn't really depict the place. The Spanish had created some other maps. They had done some data collection in the 300 years of colonial control, but most of that was not accessible to the folks who were dreaming of canal building. They start to publish some of that in this period. So there's more information becoming available, but not before the Canal Dreamers are already putting into works the idea of building this thing and trying to implement it. And so, yeah, they have very, very little information, which I guess is what makes Curtis Bolton and his brother and a couple of other business associates send this surveyor named Edmund Blunt down to the Nicaraguan route to try to get some sort of very valuable scientific data about the landscape. And that's a whole disastrous mission. It's sort of fascinating.
Yeah, I do want us to talk about Edmund Blunt's expedition to survey a potential canal route. But first, I am curious, was there just an actual dearth of information, or was it a dearth of information written in English? Because in your book, Canal Dreamers, you mentioned that even John Quincy Adams, who spoke and read a lot of different languages, somehow did not read or speak Spanish, which was something that made Aaron Palmer unique because he did speak and write in Spanish.
I mean, John Quincy Adams, who was very bright and had a lot of diplomatic experience, couldn't find Nicaragua on the map. Like, he thought that this canal plan was all about Panama, and he thought Panama was part of this new Central American republic. So his geographic knowledge of the isthmus is pretty bad, and he's probably the most educated person in diplomatic affairs in the U.S. So you could just imagine what average people, their knowledge of Central America is minuscule. And so, yeah, they just don't really have the information in Spanish archives. So Spain was really proprietary over its information, and it doesn't make its way into English language sources. Aaron Palmer, who's a polyglot, has the advantage of being able to read Alexander Humboldt, who's this scientific explorer who supports the idea of a canal pretty vehemently. He writes first in French, and then it's translated to English. So Palmer can read in French first, so he kind of has access to that information. But I think even more importantly, Palmer's family were Quakers. His father died when he was a young man. His mother remarried a sort of elite Mexican man who ended up, because of the Age of Revolutions, stuck in New York and became Columbia's first Spanish professor eventually. His mother was also a linguist, and so he is learning language that most Americans don't have access to. He also, his parents, so his stepfather and his mother, ran a boarding school for the children of Spanish American elites. And so he had networks that most people did not have access to find out information about what was going on around the Spanish Empire in a period when the Spanish Empire was collapsing. So yeah, he has more access. He also, as a lawyer, represents a bunch of folks, Americans and foreigners, involved in the wars for independence in Spanish America. So he has clients who are bringing him information. So he kind of has a very unique situation in that he has the language skills and the personal networks to know more. But I still couldn't find the smoking gun of exactly how Palmer found out about this. I kind of know how Curtis Bolton found out about it, because one of the maps that this Nicaraguan mayor sends out end up in the hands of some Mexican politicians who recruit adventurers, British and American adventurers, who bring the map to the US and then recruit investors. And Curtis Bolton is one of the first investors in that enterprise. So he had seen this plano ideal in an early stage of this story. I don't know how Palmer got it. I try to figure it out, and I put some guesses in this book. I think one of the ways in which Palmer figured out the canal possibility is that he hires this agent who is a man who constantly changes his identity, his age, but who was involved in the Mexican Empire and so has connections in Central America. So perhaps this comes from that agent's knowledge also out of this period of Mexican annexation of Central America.
So Palmer had some real competitive advantages. He spoke Spanish. He had a network of Mexican and Central American people who provided him with a lot of information and intelligence. And while Curtis Bolton didn't have those advantages, he was trying to create another big advantage for himself, which was to send Edmund Blunt to Nicaragua to survey a canal route. Jess, why don't we take a sponsor break, and then we'll dig into Edmund Blunt's attempts to survey a potential canal route, because we should see how this advantage plays out. You know, every week when I sit down with a historian, I'm reminded of something. Good history takes a lot of time, care, and resources. The research behind each episode, the careful myth-busting, the effort to bring you trustworthy stories about people who shaped early America, that all matters. And it's all supported by listeners like you. If Ben Franklin's World has ever helped you see the past more clearly, or given you a moment of curiosity in your day, I hope you'll consider supporting the show. Ben Franklin's World is really a labor of love, and listener donations make it possible for me to bring you in-depth interviews, careful research, and the kind of history that sparks your curiosity and builds understanding. Your gift today, whether it's a one-time donation or a monthly or annual contribution, directly supports the production of this podcast. It helps cover the costs of research, audio editing, hosting, and all the work that goes into creating these conversations that you can rely on. So please help support this show. Make a donation at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. And to those who have already contributed, thank you. Listeners like Matt S., Susan R., Charles P., Christine E., and Rebecca Z., you help make this work possible, and I am so grateful for your support. And thank you. Thank you for listening, for your generosity, and most of all, for being a part of this special community of people who know that history matters. Jessica, would you tell us about Curtis Bolton's quest to create a competitive advantage for himself by sending Edmund Blunt to survey a potential canal route across Lake Nicaragua?
Absolutely. And I love the way you frame that, because Palmer's language advantage and network advantage is very dissimilar from the type of advantage Blunt is seeking. Because what Bolton wants Blunt to do is to gather data. But poor Edmund Blunt, he was hired to provide data to Curtis Bolton and his partners about the canal route. He was supposed to measure heights and lengths and evaluate rocks and come to some assessment about the ease of constructing a canal and exactly where the canal should be constructed. But unfortunately for Blunt, his mission started late. It proved fatal for several of his team members. He lost his surveying boat, which left him without a bunch of equipment that he needed. He ran headlong into a civil war in Nicaragua over whether they would or would not join the new republic forming in Guatemala City. And the delays led him to only begin his research during that rainy season when it becomes like almost impossible. In fact, he calls it the land impassable to actually do his investigations. So in Nicaragua, like I said, the water cycle is really dramatic, but it isn't just that there's a dry season and a wet season. There's also windstorms called papagayos on Lake Nicaragua in between the dry season and the wet season. And his poor crew gets stuck with all of this. So the river was navigable when he first got there, but he couldn't bring his equipment. When he finally had permission from the folks in Granada to go down the river again, and the Civil War had calmed down, he couldn't really get down the river very easily, and getting back up was almost impossible. The crew on the canoe that they're using had to come out and dig the sediment out of the way. It took forever to get his equipment back to Nicaragua. And then when he finally starts, the rain begins and the river's water supply returns, but the rainforests on the land between the lake and the Pacific became what he called impassable. And Blunt was, as his Dickensian name suggests, not great at figuring out social nuance. So when he tried to set up a camp in the forest to take measurements, the local men he hired kept abandoning him. And perhaps that's resistance. Perhaps that's because they don't want a canal to be on the land that's their home. But also it could be because they actually know how miserable it is to be in a rainforest during the rainy season. At the worst moment of this experience for Blunt, his instruments were covered in red bugs. He had no food. He was being eaten by a whole variety of insects, and he was starving. And he had to walk shoeless and sick through thorns and mud. So his time in Nicaragua provided no data. The whole point of it was to get data, and he could bring back none. But ironically, it didn't stop his canal dreams, because when he wrote his final report, he fully supported going ahead with the construction of the canal. In fact, he volunteered to go back and collect data again. So it's sort of a wild story about both learning the hardships of this place, but not actually learning them and processing them in a usable way. In some ways, he had all the data he needed. This is a very rough place to do this work. He found that out for himself, but he didn't report that back to his employers.
It is just so interesting to me that the Canal Dreamers had no data. And yet they all wanted to jump in and volunteer to build this canal, no matter the cost. And we know it's going to cost them a lot of money. So why don't we talk about how much this canal could cost? would you tell us about the influence of the Erie Canal, which celebrated its bicentennial in October 2025? Could we talk about the influence of the Erie Canal on the Central American canal dream? Like, how did the Erie Canal and its success inform these canal dreamers' dreams of building a lucrative interoceanic canal?
Absolutely. Canal dreams were happening all over the country for canals. Some of the very same people who are advocating in newspapers for the construction of a Nicaraguan canal are also advocating for canals in Florida. There's just a sort of boom to build canals in the US, and in this case, sort of an external improvement, right? Like build a canal somewhere else that will also transform the nation's fortunes. So the Erie Canal really did transform the US. It connected the Mississippi Valley to the Atlantic Ocean through 360 miles or so of land and natural and artificial waterways. The artificial waterways had to be constructed, but the natural waterways had to be worked in. And it used 35 locks, which are kind of, like I said before, aquatic elevators to lift and lower shallow, narrow boats laden with people and things from the interior of the continent to the world's markets. It made what we think of as Midwestern lands much more valuable and increased demand for dispossessing indigenous peoples who lived in places that were now accessible to trade and hadn't been quite as accessible earlier. It was so successful that folks all around the country tried to copy it. New York Governor DeWitt Clinton worked for decades to make this canal happen, and he sat atop a pyramid of patronage, which was the coin of the realm in this period of American political history. So the Erie Canal was a tool for DeWitt Clinton's political rise in this time because this is often called the era of good feelings. There's only one political party, and it's individual politicians who can give out jobs and give out contracts, who acquire political capital in that way. And so DeWitt Clinton was a really powerful person in a time when the power structure looked quite a bit different from how it does today, although patronage is still a part of American politics. And he didn't get rich out of this canal. I think that's part of his motivation, as I mentioned earlier, for wanting to build an interoceanic waterway is if it was a private company, he might have more of a shot of turning that same sort of, this time world-changing, that time like country-changing power, turn some of that into actual money, which he needed because he died broke. They had to auction off his possessions.
Well, we've never heard of the Nicaraguan Interoceanic Canal, so would you tell us why this canal dream was never achieved?
So the canal proved eminently dreamable, but entirely undoable. And I think that the reason for this had a lot to do with the timing. The timing was terrible. Although it might seem like the dreamers were too early because the Panama Canal didn't open until 1914, I actually think canal dreams came too late. The quest for an interoceanic canal began as a half-century of revolutionary fluidity, solidified into new nations, and freely flowing capital moved toward cotton and coal. The canal proved too revolutionary for the age of revolutions, and this bad timing teaches us about how rapidly historical periods can end.
But why do you think early Americans failed to build this canal? Why did their plans fail?
I tend not to think about this as a story about failure. I don't think about the quest as resulting in failure. If anything, the canal quest shows us that sometimes very powerful people can prove incapable of accomplishing what they presume to be predestined. The failure of their dreams could be for others a triumph over nightmares. So to the rural Nicaraguans who inhabited the land that would become water, those guys who abandoned Blunt in the forest, or the indigenous men and women who lived along the river, which was controlled by a very powerful indigenous nation called the Miskito, and the sharks who still swim up from the salty Caribbean to the freshwater lake, not turning their homelands and home waters into the world's waterway, was a victory. So if we escape the false binary of success and failure and instead take our cue from Columbus's unfulfilled quest, we need not squint to see the historical power of unrealized dreams.
Jessica, when you look back on all these early canal dreamers, What do you think they reveal about the early United States, its ambitions, and its sense of place in the world in the 1820s?
So in the summer of 1826, when Aaron Palmer and Charles de Bonesky, his constantly name-changing associate, arrived at the door of the Adams family house in Quincy, Massachusetts, to seek the support of the president, who was mourning his famous father's death, the United States was not quite the young country it had been 50 years earlier when the Declaration was signed. And yet, it was not the superpower that it would come to be in the 20th century. The country was figuring out its place in the world and triangulating itself between the old powers of Europe, the new countries of Spanish America, and the indigenous nations that still controlled much of the hemisphere. The U.S. government was built on corrupt bargains that depended on patronage and deals made in back rooms that often proved disastrous for everyone involved. The quest for the canal helps us see early America in a new context. The U.S. was not the only country powered by corrupt bargains. It was not the only place full of dreamers imagining infrastructure. And it wasn't the only place thinking about human-caused environmental change. The U.S. was also not one thing. Individuals, corporations, states, and governments had ambitions, imaginations, and a sense of their own place in the world. Most importantly, I think the story of the 1820s quest for an interoceanic canal shows how some of the most powerful people of the time could not accomplish what they believed to be predestined. And I think this is an important corrective to the way we think about diplomats, plutocrats, and presidents, even to today.
In the epilogue of Canal Dreamers, you provide a really nice overview of how the United States and Central America finally built a canal linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So would you provide us with the highlights of how the Panama Canal came to be in 1914?
So in his anti-canal speeches in the Central American Congress in the 1820s, Jose del Valle, who was the rival for the first presidency and perhaps the biggest canal dreamer in Central America, he turned to sort of dissuade Central Americans from awarding a contract to Aaron Palmer's agent. And he argued that beneath the brilliance, that's his word, brilliance of the canal, lie dangerous chasms that would destroy the country. He thought about questions like, what if the country needed to charge high tolls to cover the canal's construction and operating costs? What would stop a richer and more powerful country from avoiding the tolls by invading and seizing the shortcut? Rather than supporting Central American independence, he argued that the canal would divide the land and lead to foreign domination. And his prediction came true, but not in Nicaragua. It came true in Panama around 1900. More mountainous and lacking Nicaragua's lake, the Panama route lingered as an incomplete French construction site under Colombian control. And in 1903, Panama declared independence. Seizing the opportunity, the U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt landed troops and an engineering team to invade the isthmus and colonize Panama. For the next decade, a team of U.S. military and civilian engineers and a workforce of mostly Caribbean laborers dug through the isthmus. They were plagued by tropical diseases and landslides. They deployed coal-powered steam shovels to dig artificial rivers and massive locks and lakes. They floated large ships over this Isthmian mountains in this sort of amazing construction feat. But to do so, they flooded rainforests. They sunk farmland that had been occupied by people for millennia, costing billions in today's dollars. The 1914 opening of the shortcut demanded a huge toll of the more than 25,000 human lives, the erasure of the region's history, and widespread environmental destruction. So there's a huge literature on the Panama Canal, and it isn't my actual area of expertise, but I strongly encourage listeners to check out the works of Julie Green, Marixa Lasso, and environmental historian Paul Sutter, who I'm not sure his book is out yet, but there's a bunch of really cool articles. So that's the story of the Panama Canal. The folks I write about influence that because their documents end up in the government records many times over the century between the 1820s and 1914. In fact, Palmer's canal contract sort of becomes a case study of why the government should build a canal and not private entities.
Well, now that we know how the Central American Canal turned out, let's move into the time warp. This is the segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Now, in episode 186, we spoke with Max Edelson about the British Empire's work to map the geography of its empire in North America and the Caribbean after the 7 Years' War. And as a result, Great Britain became rich in geographic and topographic information about its empire. So, Jessica, in your opinion, what might have happened if Spain had likewise mapped its empire just as thoroughly as Great Britain did? Do you think a Nicaraguan canal would have been built if Spain had created maps and possessed better geographic knowledge about its imperial holdings?
That's such a great question. Well, maps certainly inspired canal dreams. There's no doubt about it. In fact, I think maps were really significant tools for creating ideas about a canal as predestined, like the world map and the Plano Ideal. But it wasn't a lack of maps that prevented those dreams from coming true. In the Spanish Empire, Central America was a peripheral place. It was not as important as Mexico or Peru, which both had silver mines. The province that included Nicaragua, Honduras, Costa Rica, El Salvador, and Guatemala was headquartered in Guatemala City, about 350 miles away from the potential canal route. And this meant that Nicaragua was basically a periphery in a periphery. And it wasn't even a fully conquered territory. The indigenous Miskitu Nation and the Rama who lived along the river controlled much of the eastern side of the isthmus. While Nicaragua had been a site of transit for the Spanish Empire in the 16th century, the transit moved to Panama pretty early in the colonial period. Nicaraguan elites continually argued for building a waterway that would return the transit to their land and water, but the Guatemalans who controlled the colonial power of that era didn't want to create a rival power group in Nicaragua. So that's one political reason why they did not build a canal. Also, Spanish officials were not on negotiating terms with their indigenous neighbors. They'd been fighting them for centuries. And so trying to negotiate the rights around the water would also have been a challenge. In response to Nicaraguan requests, the Spanish government did send cartographers and surveyors to the route, and they produced several maps and some surveying data. All of that was copied by the British agent who was sent to Guatemala in the 1820s. And so there are actually copies of the surveying data and these Spanish maps in the British National Archives. So maps were not really the issue. What stopped the Spanish from building a canal was a lack of political will and the choice not to invest financial resources in a canal. Heck, we have amazing maps today, but there still isn't a waterway through Nicaragua. The dream persists, however. And the dream still has consequences. So my book is really about the historical power of dreams that don't come true. It argues for the significance of a thing that didn't end up happening. Some might confuse this with a hypothetical or a counterfactual, but I am not arguing for imagining a world with a Nicaraguan canal. Instead, I want us to see the historical power of a dream that has never come true.
Jess, you have a track record of exploring financial follies. The Panic of 1837, we talked about the Panic of 1825, and now the Central American Canal that did not come to be. So, are you still researching financial follies? Are you working on something new now?
Well, I'm researching another fun topic, but it isn't financial. So I teach a really popular class at the University of New Hampshire that's called The History of Animals, and I'm planning on writing a book in that vein. But the little project I'm currently working on is on the history of the sharks of Lake Nicaragua. For a long time, they were thought to be the world's only species of freshwater sharks and to have evolved as an ocean bay turned into a freshwater lake. But in the 20th century, the same scientists who defined the species changed their minds and began to argue that these sharks were not a separate species. but instead common bull sharks that individually adapted their internal salinity as they traveled up the river to the lake. I'm intrigued by the double story of adaptability that's involved in this tale. I call it the shark's tale. Both of the shark's adaptation and the ways people have understand the shark's adaptation, but also these ichthyologists' ability to adapt their thinking. I think learning about the history of adaptation and more broadly about the history of animals sounds both timely and fun.
And if you're looking for a sneak peek of this project, the sharks make several guest appearances in Canal Dreamers. Now, Jess, if we have more questions for you, where is the best place for us to reach you?
So I try to keep my UNH webpage up to date, so that's probably the best place to find me. You can just search my name and UNH and it should pop up. But my email address is jessica.lepler@unh.edu. And you can also find me on Bluesky, where my handle is at jlepler.bsky.social.
Jessica Lepler, thank you for joining us and for helping us think about canals and canal dreams during the early American Republic.
Thank you so much, Liz. I had a lot of fun talking about it.
Jessica just showed us that sometimes the most revealing histories are the ones where dreams don't come true because they go unrealized. The early 19th century quest to build a canal across Central America wasn't just about digging through land and linking oceans. It was a story about ambition, diplomacy, and timing. The Nicaraguan canal proved imminently dreamable, as Jessica phrased it, but also entirely undoable in its time. Still, the Nicaraguan canal's legacy lives on in the maps that people made, the fortunes that men were willing to risk for it, and the political maneuvers that some were willing to make. We often view American leaders as destined to reshape the continent, but as Jessica revealed, even influential figures like DeWitt Clinton and John Quincy Adams couldn't bend the world to their will. But these leaders' quote, failure to see this canal through was ultimately a triumph for the rural Nicaraguans and indigenous communities who lived and worked on the lands along the proposed canal route, showing us that some people's dashed hopes were the dreams of others. Now, as Jessica related, the story of the Nicaraguan canal dream challenges us to reconsider what we mean by success in history. Does success look like projects completed and empires built? Or does it look like resistance, restraint, and decisions not to act? This canal dream never came to be, but it still shaped diplomacy, business, and geopolitics for decades. So as we reflect on the ambitions of early Americans and the young United States, we might ask, what dreams are we chasing today that future generations may view differently, not as inevitable, but as revealing of who we are today and what we value as a nation? Look for more information about Jessica, her book, Canal Dreamers, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. BenFranklin'sWorld.com/428. Canal Dreams, like podcasts, are best shared with friends. So if you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. After all, friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Joseph Edelman, Karen Wolf, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what's a dream or ambition from history that you once thought was inevitable, but now you see it in a different light? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Liz@BenFranklin'sWorld.com.